Let's talk about the second house and the fifth house and what happens when they interact. As you can see on the screen, the second house is literally the slice of the sky that is just below the eastern horizon. And the fifth house is the slice of the sky that's on the west side of underground. It's important to understand what the houses literally are because everything that they symbolize is based on what they literally are. So for example, because the second house is below the eastern horizon, it signifies things which support or hold up the east. Whatever the east signifies is held up or supported by the second house. So we can divide that into two things. The east signifies beginnings and the east signifies becoming visible. So the second house would be pro both of those. Or, if you like, another way to look at the whole second house is everything it symbolizes is everything that provides foundation for real stuff. Foundation and stability. The main thing that the second house indicates is family. And by family, it doesn't just mean blood, but it also means the people who support you in any way. Hold you up, give you stability, give you strength. Obviously, the first house signifies your birth, so the second house, pro-birth, is the people that you're born from, your family. Also, the second house signifies your wealth. The wealth is the provider of stability, and the wealth is kind of like the family, which allows the birth of your endeavors. You use the resources of your wealth to do things. The second house also signifies health, because the health is the basis on which the body manifests. So the body is the first house, and the second house is the basis or the foundation of the strength provided to the body. So it's all the health in the body. As a result of being health, it has a lot to do with nutrition. It also physiologically has to do with the mouth, so it has to do with eating, and it has to do even with speaking. Another thing about the second house is it has to do with knowledge. This is because it is supportive of things becoming visible. Invisible means unknown, and visible means known. So the second house provides knowledge or understanding of things, helping to reveal what things are and understand what things are. And finally, the second house signifies real things, or practicality actually, pro-realism, a realistic outlook or pragmatism, realism. Because the first house is where everything becomes real. So the second house, which supports it, is the attitude that's favorable towards reality and making things real and being realistic. That is the second house. That is basically everything that the second house signifies, every major permutation of what it signifies. Now let's take a look at the fifth house. As we said, it is literally the slice of sky that's on the west side of underground. And that's where it gets all its symbolism from. So the underground is your internal self, your private inner being, and the west is other people and intangible things. So basically, the fifth house signifies the fourth house moving towards the seventh. Or in other words, your inner self moving towards other people. And that is why the primary thing indicated by the fifth house is love. That is what love is, how your internal emotions move towards others. Love has two branches. Love means understanding. Love means knowing the other person, caring enough about the other person to perceive them carefully, know what they like, know what they dislike, know what makes them happy, know what makes them unhappy. To understand somebody else is half of love. Hence, the fifth house represents understanding. Hence, it's the house of intelligence, the thing which sorts out and understands other people. And as a result, it has to do with education, getting the information that you need to understand things and people. On the other half of what love is an expression. It's not just a feeling. The fourth house is just the feeling. But in the fifth house, the feeling is moving. It's emoting. It's coming out. So the fifth house has to do with expression, taking the things which are inside and bringing them out for other people to experience, bringing them out. So the fifth house signifies creativity, expressiveness, the ability to express. So it's quite an artistic house. And This is why it signifies children, because it's about bringing things out from inside. So it's about childbirth. It's about productivity in general, creativity in general. Productivity. It's a fertile house. It's a productive house. So now you know the essentials of what the fifth house signifies and what the second house signifies. Now, what's very interesting is to talk about what happens when the two houses combine in a chart. Now, if you're thinking, how can two houses combine? The second house is one part of the sky and the fifth house is another part of the sky. How do you get those two things to combine? Well, every house has a lord. Depending on whatever sign makes the house, then the lord of that sign becomes the lord of that house. So if Capricorn rises, then the second house is Aquarius. It's the second sign from Capricorn. Saturn owns Aquarius, so Saturn would be the lord of the second house. Taurus would be the fifth sign from Capricorn, so Venus would be the lord of the fifth house. So based on the movements of those two lords, you could get interactions between them, and that would cause interactions of the two houses. So basically speaking, how can you get the second and the fifth house to interact with each other? Well, you could put the second lord in the fifth house. You could put the fifth lord in the second house. You could do both. You could put the second and the fifth lord together somewhere else, anywhere else. You could put the second and the fifth lord in mutual opposition, or somehow or another that they mutually aspect each other. These are some conventional ways that the second and the fifth house interact, but a very important other way, or non-conventional way, in which the second and fifth house can interact is if they're sequential or polar in terms of how important they are in the chart. So if this, like for example, if the fifth house is the most important or prominent house in the chart and the second house is the next most, then they're actually operating back to back in a person. Or if one is on opposite ends from the other, if the fifth is the least productive and the second is the most productive, then they're also resonating with each other because they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. This is a lesser known technique, but if you want to know the sequence of your houses so that you can tell if you have these houses supporting each other, interacting with each other, you can get it from my report called The Houses of Life, which you can get from victorcara.com/H. This report uses the 15th chapter of the medieval classic on Vedic astrology called Paladipika. That chapter gives really, really great rules for how to evaluate the prominence and positivity of a house. And then after performing that evaluation on every house, you can order the houses. And then when you order the houses, you get like a DNA code of the chart, a DNA code for how the houses are working. So if in that code you have a 2 and a 5, or a 5 and a 2, or a 5 on one end and a 2 on the other end, then you have 5 and 2 working together, even if you don't necessarily have the second lord in the fifth house or the fifth lord in the second house. So that being said, let's now move on to how to interpret the interaction of the second and the fifth house. As you probably get the vibe already just by knowing what the two houses represent, they're pretty similar to each other. They're pretty harmonious with each other. There's nothing really clashing about what they represent. So it's a pretty overall good thing to have 2 and 5 interacting with each other. There are actually 3 important points that I want to cover so that you fully understand the main crux of the interpretation. The first is that the second house signifies family. So what do you think is important about the fifth house then in that context? If the second house represents family, what about the fifth house is resonant with that? The fifth house signifies children. Children are the basis of family. So, because the second house signifies family and the fifth house signifies children, they're harmonious on this topic of family. So when you have 2 and 5 interacting in a chart, whether it's just by second lord being in the fifth house or not, or some other way, you should be inclined to interpret that this native has a pretty good family life. Or at the very least, they have a productive family. They have a fairly relatively larger family compared to their parents or compared to whatever is the norm for their culture. Another thing that you're pretty safe to interpret for the person. I say pretty safe because all the interpretations don't stand alone. They stand in the context of the rest of the chart. But basically, you should start thinking about making an interpretation that this person likes family. Family resonates well for them. So they would actually be inclined to love their partner, love their spouse, and love their children, and love their family members. The second of the three very important things to understand about the resonances between the second and the fifth house is that the second house signifies knowledge. What do you think is resonant in the fifth house in the context of that? In the context that the second house represents knowledge, the fifth house represents intelligence and education and all that. So in a chart where the second and the fifth houses are working together, expect that person to be pretty smart. They should be intelligent. They should be educated, if not formally. It doesn't really make a difference, but they're good at getting information. They're good at learning stuff. And another permutation of this, because of the particular nature of both of these houses, they are actually could be described as thoughtful, not just intelligent, but thoughtful. It's kind of a semi-emotional intelligence, which is like an empathetic intelligence, because it's mixed with love and family. So they're intelligently thoughtful people. And the third of the three things which are very important to understand to get a complete picture of what's going on when the second and fifth house interact is the fact that the second house is the house of wealth. Now, bearing that in mind, what do you think is important about the fifth house? Second house is wealth. What about the fifth house resonates with that? The fifth house is fertile. Fertile means wealth. It's productive. The fifth house is creative, productive. The second house is productive and wealthy. So this is another good vibe between the two. Hence, in this native who has 2 and 5 interacting, they're probably creative, they're probably productive, they're probably fruitful, their efforts probably bear fruit. They can probably get paid for their efforts. And because of the whole overall nature of the two houses, expect them to not be particularly hedonistic about the accumulation of wealth. Of course, it sits in the context of the rest of the chart, but on its own, expect them to not be too hedonistic or selfish about the accumulation of wealth. They'll be likely to accumulate wealth rather easily or as a side effect of their natural efforts. And they'll also be inclined to use it for their family, to use it for the people that they love. And so they're supportive. So they are able to earn money to support family. That is what is very important to know about the second house and the fifth house and how the two interact. And again, you can utilize this information in any chart where you see the second lord in the fifth house, or the fifth lord in the second house, or both, or the second lord and the fifth lord joining somewhere, or mutually aspecting each other. But especially it's important when you know the DNA code of the houses and what houses are in which order in the chart, which is a difficult thing to do on your own, but you can get this report that I offer, Houses of Life, with a whole bunch of other information, but one of the key central gems in it is this code. And you can get that at victorcarrera.com/H. And hopefully this video will help you understand what's going on there when you have those situations with the second and the fifth house interacting. Thank you very much.